So let's start with some myths. I think it's really important whenever you discover something new, like a new platform, like podcasting, there might be some demons in your head or loud voices that are trying to stop you. And there's very common myths out there about these things. And I just want to bust through some of these. Obviously, you've all taken action before, and you know how powerful the mindset is before starting something. So let's start with podcasting myth number one, the idea that you have to be a natural-born speaker, storyteller, or interviewer. It's a little bit more... it takes a little bit more effort to put your voice behind something. There's a lot of, worry about, well, how are people going to respond to my voice versus text, right? Like a blog post or something that you could easily hide behind your keyboard. A little bit more, it takes a little bit more gusto to put your voice out there. However, I have to say, I myself am not a natural-born speaker or storyteller or interviewer. This was me back in 2008. I had just gotten laid off from my architecture industry. I was starting my online business in the architecture space, which is where I came from. My first online business was about architecture, actually, and it was a podcast that gave me the introduction to the world of online business. So I had always made the idea that I wanted to start a podcast of my own. So in December of 2008, I bought all this equipment. As you can see here, I was living with my parents because I had just lost my job and I was getting married, so I was trying to save money. But I was like, I want to start a podcast. So I actually made an announcement to my blog at smartpassiveincome.com, which I also just started at the time. Hey, everybody, get ready. I'm going to start a podcast very soon. Here's the equipment. Get ready. It's coming. This was December of 2008. My first episode didn't come out until July of 2010. That was a year and a half later. And if I could go back into time, if I could step into a DeLorean from Back to the Future and go back into time, I would have done it much sooner because it was absolutely game-changing for me. Now, why did it take me a year and a half to finally have the courage to do a show? Number one, it was just scary, right? Putting my voice out there. Every time I started, I was like, oh, this is scary. I'm going to go back to blogging. Secondly, I just wasn't sure how people were going to respond to it. It seemed just more serious than a blog post because, again, I was putting my voice out there. And it's crazy because there was only one person that ever said anything nasty about my voice. Myself, the demon in my head. That was it. And ever since publishing my first episode in July 2010, which, by the way, I recorded 3 times. The first time just was really bad. The second time, I scripted the whole thing, which was also not the right way to go. I remember listening to that after I recorded it, and I just kind of put myself to sleep. And then the third time, I just said, you know what, screw it. I'm going to do it, put myself out there and see what happens. And I haven't looked back since. And ever since then, I've published 5 different podcasts. Smart Passive Income, Ask Pat, like was mentioned earlier. Then the One Day Business Breakthrough podcast with my buddy Chris Ducker. That's a seasonal show that comes out. Then the Food Trucker School podcast. And then I actually created a podcast with my son. That's my 9-year-old son, Keone, there on the right-hand side. We came out with a show called All of Your Beeswax. He literally just comes home from school. We get behind the microphone. We chat about school and things he's learned. And that's there to help inspire kids and parents to have conversations about cool stuff. And that's a lot of fun. And he's 9 and he's podcasting too. Actually, this was us at an event where we announced that he and I were in front of 2,000 people. This is an event called Podcast Movement. And yes, we did spend time to have matching outfits, which took a little bit of time, but I think it was totally worth it. But the coolest thing about this is this has helped inspire more people to start podcasts too, because if a 9-year-old can do it, then others can do it too. Now, actually, it was the fact that he was so used to speaking behind the microphone that got him the courage to speak on stage. So I know a lot of you want to speak on stages as well. The podcast was my sort of, level 1 before going into level 2 and on the stage 2, which is fun. So it can definitely open up a lot of doors for that. And actually a lot of conference directors and people who kind of hire people to be on their stages, they look to see if you have a podcast now. And the reason is because they can kind of get a sense for who you are and the voice you have and your character and the things you have to say. So I definitely recommend starting a podcast if starting to speak on stage is something that you'd like to do as well. Starting a podcast has also allowed me to connect with other influencers, people who I would have no business chatting with otherwise. For example, Gary Vee was coming out with a book called Jab, 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 Right Hook. And I reached out to him and I said, hey, I have a podcast. I'd love to feature you on the show and also help push some books out for you. And guess what? He said yes. And that was a lot of fun. And now, as a result of this, Gary Vee and I are friends, which is kind of amazing. We both are advisors for Pencils of Promise, which builds schools around the world. And we've connected at events and like we, hang out when we're there. And, he and I are quite opposite in our styles, but we're friends and we wouldn't have connected if it wasn't for the podcast, which is pretty amazing. So you might have an influencer in mind that you might kind of go, oh, well, like, I don't know why they'd give me the light of day. But then when you have a podcast, guess what? You have an amazing asset that you can use to invite these people on, gain some knowledge for you and your audience, but also build a rapport with them at the same time. I've also done the same thing with Tim Ferriss and, all these authors who are coming out with books. By the way, that's a small tip. If you want to connect with an influencer on your show, get them at the time that they're saying yes to those things, like when they're coming out with a book or when they're coming out with a new course or something like that. They're going to be more likely to say yes at that point, which is pretty cool. Next, it can help you monetize. This is part of my income report, which I share on my blog. And this was in July 2017. I made a total of nearly $250,000 in course sales that month. I sell a number of courses. And it was actually one podcast episode that helped account for more than half of that. $150,000 came as a result of a single podcast episode. And I'll show you exactly how that episode was structured at the end, because that's something all of us can do. The podcast has also allowed me to connect with fans. I know a lot of you have fans, a lot of you have followers, and it's just a deeper level of connection with your podcast listeners because they're listening for you for that long and they hear your voice, they hear your intonation, they get to know you like a friend. And this is a board that I have. This is kind of Inception. If you see my video live right now, this is actually the same board that's behind me right now. These are thank you notes that people have sent me. 99% of them come and mention the podcast. Like, I found you on your podcast. It was your podcast, that episode with your podcast. And it's so funny because I used to blog more than I podcast. I used to, like when my podcast came out, it was only every other week that it came out. And actually more people said thank you because of my podcast versus my blog. So I switched it. I started podcasting more than blogging. And I'll tell you, the results are amazing. And I got fans now, fans as a result of my show. And Sanhen here says, I also have friends now who found me through my podcast. It's an amazing way to connect with people, right? And the cool thing is I can now, thanks to my podcast, just be like, hey, I will be at this restaurant because I'm here at this event at this time. And people will show up. It's kind of mind-blowing, the connection you have with people. And I even have a lot of kids who listen to my show too, which is kind of cool. And why I keep it swear-free, so I can't share Gary Vaynerchuk with these kids, but I can be somebody who can be a role model for them too. So that's pretty cool. A lot of great things can happen when you start your show. And again, I wasn't a natural-born storyteller, but you get to become better over time. Next, podcasting myth number 2, you have to podcast in a big niche to succeed. That is not true. Here is an example. This is my friend Phil. He's a student of mine. He has a podcast called Scanner School. This is like those police scanners where you can listen in on the like emergency systems and police lines. He's a super nerd about that. And he was like, hey, I just want to like chat with people about this and get them on my show and talk about nerdy things. And guess what? Now he has super fans. He mentioned this in our Facebook group. I had to come here to share. It's a very funny feeling to realize you've created super fans. I have listeners who follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and now YouTube. They comment on every podcast, and they're there for almost every Facebook Live session. This guy is a super nerd about these things. And guess what? They all like idolize him now. He's become like the most super of all super nerds in this space, which is really cool. So it's just amazing. You don't need to have a large niche. Actually, you are better off the more narrow it is, to a point, obviously, but you're better off the more narrow because you can become that leader in that space much sooner, much quicker. Podcasting myth number 3, you have to have an audience already. And that's not true. This is another student of mine. Her name's Sophie Walker. She started a podcast in Australia interviewing moms and soon-to-be moms about their pregnancies. And she literally, starting from scratch, no email list, no audience, no nothing. She started the show only, and she was able to grow so fast as a result of that. She actually became the #1 kids and family podcast in Australia. And again, she started from scratch, which is amazing. So if you're looking to grow your audience and even do it from scratch, you can do that with podcasting as well. And so you don't have to have an audience already. Podcasting myth number 4, you can't make money until you get a big listenership. That's only true if you think that sponsorships and advertising is the only way to make money from your show. But you guys are lead collection pros, right? You know that content, when you have a person's attention for that long and you provide value, you can send them places where they can give you email addresses, they can download things and become a part of your funnel. So you can definitely do that too. And then podcasting myth number 5, podcasting is easy. It's not easy like putting on a light switch, but it's easier now than ever before.